In your view, I understand you think the government may be moving too quickly out of lockdown.
Absolutely. I have to say I'm very worried about the possibility of a second wave. Now the risk becomes greater with the opening up of the lockdown too early. We know that we have 8,000 new infections in the UK every day. And, you know, when we went into lockdown, it wasn't very different from that. So we've been through a peak much, much higher than that. At the peak, we had nearly 1,500 deaths in a day. We are now down to 200 or so deaths a day. But nevertheless, the deaths follow the infectivity rate. And there's always a 2-week delay between the two. And I fear that we can anticipate with the uplifting of the lockdown that this could get worse. What I believe must happen as a condition of opening up the lockdown, first of all, is that the test, trace and isolate capability is brought up to scratch and tested for at least a week or two before we actually open up schools and so on. The second is that we need to see that local communities are fully engaged in the whole process. Remember that schools are a major part of the local community, but so are GPs, so are the whole structure of local authorities has essentially been left out of the considerations of the government until very recently. But if we continue with 8,000 infections a day and continue to lift the lockdown, then I fear the risk of a second wave becomes very real. So let me just say, the quicker we get out of this epidemic, the sooner we can get back to normal economic life. But if we show impatience, just as we're getting it under control, and I think the government is showing impatience, the risk of a second wave becomes greater, and that means it takes longer.
So, David, there's been a lot of different scientific opinion. I think that's fair to say across the spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum has been the Swedish experiment of trying to get some form of herd immunity as well. Now, I know that the infection rates and mortality rates are greater than other Scandinavian countries. But is there a case to be made that actually the creation of some form of herd immunity, as we've seen in Sweden, should be extrapolated to other countries? And actually Britain needs to get more people with a degree of antibodies, a degree of immunity, and perhaps as long as we protect the most vulnerable areas of community, then that should be potentially a way forward.
That is not a way forward. I think that if we go for herd immunity, the number of deaths in the population is going to be very large indeed. You say protect the vulnerable community. The process of protecting those who are vulnerable is not very clear. We know that, for example, doctors and nurses have died in a premature way through dealing with patients with COVID-19. And these are people perfectly healthy, not showing the symptoms, the problems that might be deemed to be at risk. So I think the issue of herd immunity is something that we heard about a long time ago. Thank goodness we're not hearing about it anymore. I think that what we will see in Sweden is a continuing rise of the number of cases until they have something like 40% of their population becoming immune. But frankly, how do we know how long that immunity will last? There are signs that the immunity may not last a very long time. Now, however, it's one way of getting out of the epidemic if you want to go down that route. But please remember, the number of deaths in the community will go up dramatically. We already in Britain have the highest rate of deaths per head of population in the world. And so as we move forward in time, you have to ask, why was that? It's because we went into the lockdown far too late. Even a week earlier, and the number of fatalities has been reduced by a factor of 2 weeks earlier, and so on. So every time there's an epidemic of this kind, we know you have to get ahead of it. This isn't a scientific issue to be discussed. You have to get ahead of it. You have to put in the process as quickly as possible to get the virus out of the public.